talk him into doing a Q&A session this morning, and I'm really fortunate to have him set aside some time for this. He's always up to great stuff, really focusing on pain, biomechanics, and a lot of running-related material. So I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to do this, Greg, and welcome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
So you're in Toronto right now. What's going on in Toronto?
It's cold, which is good because I have to run later.
You didn't call in sick today to do this webinar, did you?
No, I called in sick to build a deck.
Okay, we actually, my wife and I and her family just helped us with the same project. So I thought it was going to take 2 days, like 5. So I wanted to just start off. I know you're a pretty prolific reader, and what article are you reading right now, or what article did you just finish?
You know what I'm just starting is 2 books actually on ACT. It's the I'll get it wrong, the acceptance and commitment therapy, because I don't know anything about it. And I think
who is the editor on that book?
What's that? Oh, I don't even remember now.
Who's the editor?
Yeah. There's a psychologist.
And how did you get turned on to that?
I think the guy who does a lot of the research on it, he works out of the NOI, with the NOI group, with Mosley and Butler, and I think he does some seminars with them. I think that's, I know I've definitely heard of him through there, but I'm not sure if that's the first time. So it's just those 2 books, and then I'm reading a lot of tendon stuff, which I always read.
And what's the other book you're reading? So one of the things that I think is pretty daunting for a lot of younger clinicians is trying to stay on top of the literature. And I mean, I think it's challenging for anyone with just how. What are some of the things that you would encourage younger therapists or clinicians to do to try and stay on top of the literature? Because you've done a great job of that.
I always troll PubMed just for topics of interest, you know, to see what's out there. I mean, at the very least, just reading the abstracts is a good start to get a feel. The big one is I find people in different fields that I follow. So if I think of the spine, like I've always followed Stu McGill. You know, he's a perfect guy for that. And a colleague of his at another university would be like Bill Maris for occupational biomechanics. So there's just like little areas. If I think of the shoulder, I'll think like Paula Ludwig and Cools, Jeremy Lewis, you know, it just goes on. If I think of pain, I have a couple names in mind. And every now and then, you know, it just sort of builds. Like now when I think of the shoulder, I actually think of a guy named Struff. He's out of Belgium, I think, with Joe Knee. You know, so I keep adding these names. Sometimes it's easier just to stick with a few people because they end up kind of being like your research buddies. So I think of people rather than specific articles.
You had covered some of Struff's work when you were out in Seattle, I believe. What was the topic that you were discussing?
So that's my favorite topic, is essentially how should we move, you know, and his work was looking at scapular dyskinesis or scapular posture related to pain. And what was so surprising was, you know, so many of the things that we typically say, like there's a faulty way for the scapula to be positioned or to move, often doesn't get linked with future pain. Maybe current pain, but even that's pretty inconsistent. And then you'll often see that you don't need to change that position or that kinematic in order to get out of pain. That's what his work tells to me a lot.
Yeah, and I would say that was something that I was definitely guilty of.
Me too.
A few years back, and you know, I would always look at, you know, the Kibler classification systems, and I still like using the Kibler scapular assistance test, but I also think that anytime we see something that seems aberrant or atypical, we automatically tie it to pain, and that's something that the research is not supporting. So,
no.
Which I think is great, because the one message that was a definite takeaway from your course is we don't need to complicate things, because the research sort of tells us that we're barking up the wrong tree if we do, to an extent. Would you say that's one of the major themes of your lectures and your presentations that you're traveling around doing right now, is to just try and simplify?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you simplify or almost find the common themes amongst very good rehab programs. And I think we think it's something else, like it's changing the biomechanic that's important. But maybe the effectiveness of the treatment is something completely different. It's just loading that area or getting the patient confident in moving their arm again. Or if their shoulder hurts, you also want to move their lower back. And so we'd always say, well, it's because you're changing the biomechanics and it's linked through a fascial sling or something. Maybe that's not it at all. And that's why you have all of these different systems out there that have gurus. And I don't mean guru in a bad way. I mean, they're brilliant people and they get people better, but they do things that are often very different and they still get success. So that doesn't always fit. Like, what is it that's the same variables? And that's what I'd really like to tease out.
And that seems to be a common theme among a lot of folks who I tend to follow and have a lot of respect for it in our fields. We're trying to simplify things or establish a framework that can basically change with emerging research where you can start plugging things in, but the framework itself shouldn't have to change.
No.
And that was something that I think was very evident from your lecture in Seattle. So yeah. And I love the fact that a lot of the times people say, well, a lot of the pain literature is questioning the biomechanics, and you were quoted as saying is the biomechanic research is questioning biomechanics, which I thought was just really slick way of putting it.
No, I totally agree. I often don't quote the pain literature to question, scapular kinematics. I think the scapular kinematic research questions the scapular kinematics. You don't need to talk about all of the other stuff. Pain literature just adds something else for us to address in our patients. And that's what I mean about simplifying. If you simplify your biomechanics, now you can spend a lot more time learning other skills to address sort of the multidimensional nature of pain. That's why simplification is good, because it kind of lets you be a little more complex, but in other areas. And that's why I tried to read from other fields.
When would you say the biomechanics do matter? I mean, could you give us an example of a situation where you think the biomechanics are directly relevant to a patient's pain presentation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, always acute injuries, biomechanics were important. And if something's acutely flared up, it's okay to think about how someone moves. It's okay to, if it's a reactive plantar fasciopathy, to tape it up and support it and put them in a big bulky shoe. The biomechanics are important there. Or if someone has back pain and it hurts when they flex, and surprisingly, they always flex their spine no matter what they do. That biomechanic or that kinematic, that's significant because it's not that flexion is bad per se. It's just that flexing pattern is now linked with pain, their pain pattern, and for some reason they don't have any other options, or maybe they're not even aware that they're always flexing their back. So that's something we can go in and change slightly or change their habit. Doesn't mean they always don't flex their spine, but just for the short term to desensitize it. So those are, two really simple examples. And then the big one, I think when you add load into the equation, like heavy load when you're lifting something heavy from the ground, for me, that's my 20-pound baby. For someone else, it's their 500-pound barbell. Maybe our technique is more important at the extremes. So you have less movement options when there's more load involved. And so I might not care about hip, adduction or knee valgus when someone's running. But if you look at the biomechanic literature when it comes to ACL tears, maybe it's more important then. But it's less important if I'm just squatting down to the ground to pick up something light.
And we had gone back and forth at one point. You had put something on Facebook, and I had bounced back talking about growing up skateboarding and snowboarding a lot, and how a lot of these very high-level athletes, and I think of really the X Games, really any discipline within the X Games, a lot of these athletes are landing with a flex spine. I mean, you see this all the time in skateboarders, motocross riders, and so I think traditionally we're taught to never load under a flex position. And I think that when you stop and take a look at a lot of these elite level athletes, you see just the opposite.
Yeah.
Would you say that's been your experience?
Oh, absolutely. I think that someone posted, I don't know if I posted that or how that started, but I see that all the time, that especially when you're strapped into a boot like that, that you'll flex the spine. So I'm doing a paper in it right now that I'm excited about. It's for the Aspetar Sports Medicine Journal, which everyone should get because it's free and you can download all the PDFs, and they get these great researchers and clinicians to write for. And it's looking at how predominant or how many sports are flexion based, and that flexing the lumbar spine even under load is not only, not only a normal thing, but it probably helps performance. And I think we consistently see that, and that's something that people say, oh no, you can't do, and I wonder, why we do it so often.
So I think back to when I was at the University of Delaware, and they had a world-class figure skating program, and you would see a lot of figure skaters coming in with low back complaints. And I wonder with figure skating, with gymnastics, when you start to land in perhaps a little bit more of an extended position, if that's more the issue. Granted, they're going into flex positions as well, but it's a lot of unilateral landings where they're essentially in a slightly more extended position. Have you seen anything in Canada? I mean, do you see a lot of figure skaters?
No, I don't, but the figures, that's a good, I think about them. But they're a good example because that's where the aesthetic drives the performance requirements, not necessarily the best function, and same with in ballet. But ballet is a neat case too, because there's a good example where you can see someone landing and they train how to land. And I think that they have less ACL injury risks, and they don't land the way we often tell a soccer player to land. They have a trunk that's upright, and they get all of their loading over the knee and the ankle without any hip flexion.
Yeah, and that research that was actually done by, or some of the research was done by my former colleague Carl Orishimo at NISMAT. And I guess a question becomes it's sort of a controlled environment to a degree relative to soccer. So that's perhaps something to keep in the back of your mind when you're reading the literature. But yeah, I mean they're training their landing patterns from a very young age, and yeah, I mean you virtually don't see any ACL injuries in that population, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if I think there was a study done in breakdancers too in AJSM, which we'll have to pull Tony Ingram in on this one, but it'd be interesting to look at injury patterns in terms of ACL in that population. So one of the things. Go ahead.
No, I was just giving the affirmative.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed from your presentation in Seattle was how you discussed tendon rehab as it relates to pain science and sort of what we can learn. Could you delve into that a bit?
Oh yeah, it's a good example of when, like, we always want to know, when do we push into pain, when do we back off, when is it too sensitized, all these things. And the tendon research almost tells us that, when you have acute reactive tendinopathy, when you've just overdone it for the weekend, you just back off for a little bit. You give it a little bit of loading because it's almost like you don't want to scare it. So just like when you have some back pain, you don't go lie down for 3 days, but you keep moving a little bit. When you have an acute reactive tendinopathy, you don't just totally rest it. You give it a little isometric for a little while, and then you slowly build back up. All pain syndromes are the same thing. You have some sort of pain for a long time, you have to reintegrate that person back into doing the things they like to do. If someone has an Achilles tendinopathy and they want to run, you can get them running again. They're even allowed to have a little pain. But at the same time, you're also loading that tendon because you're asking it to adapt and to change. I think as therapists, we always just find some catalyst. We know the body's going to adapt, so we find the right catalyst for it. In the persistent pain stuff, we find the right catalyst to get that person to change. It gets trickier than with simple tendons, but we're still trying to find the driver or whatever is holding them back. And then we facilitate change by challenging them or confronting them in some way. Sometimes it's physically, sometimes it's a cognitive component where they think they're damaged and we kind of prove to them with an exercise or with pain science or just cajoling that they're not as damaged as they think. So I think the tendon and persistent pain states parallel each other.
Would you say in Canada that you still see a lot of clinicians just directly go to an eccentric training protocol, a la Alfredson?
All the time. We just taught a running injury course on the weekend, and everyone's eccentric. And it's just funny. I think it's just a case of something getting in the popular media and popular culture, and that's why Malieris's research was good with this systematic review. It doesn't matter if it's eccentric. There's nothing evil about a concentric, which is great because then it simplifies it again, right? Just load it, and then it changes.
Yeah, and I think that's just such a great message for a lot of younger clinicians who may feel overwhelmed with all the literature is figure out the entry point. It's okay to have a little bit of discomfort and progressively load. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and the research supports it. So one other thing with Malieris's work, you obviously read the study looking at the relationship between loss of dorsiflexion and volleyball players and how that correlated with patellar tendinopathy.
Yeah, prospectively too, yeah.
Yeah. What was your reaction to that paper? Did that surprise you?
It bugged me.
Yeah.
Because my bias is not to care about range of motion. I even emailed Pete on that because I was hoping maybe he changed his mind. But no, it's a good thing. It's a good one because I always talk about when biomechanics matters, and so to make for me in the past to make a blanket statement like flexibility doesn't matter probably isn't fair, right? It does matter. We just have to figure out in what instances. And because volleyball players, they land like ballerinas, right? After they jump, they land and they keep their trunks upright because they're going to jump up again or their hands are up. You don't see them bending too much or a lot of their jumping. So the idea there, if they're just getting their load absorption through the knee, they also have to get it through their ankle. So it makes sense if they didn't have a lot of ankle flexibility that the knee might get overloaded with the patellar tendinopathy. So that's just one of those cases. Yeah.
Are you pretty strict with the way you measure ankle dorsiflexion?
I kind of make stuff up. So I sorry, I don't know if that's strict or loose. I would try to make it similar to whatever they have to do in their goal task and then measure it there. It kind of makes it difficult to compare across norms, but with stuff like that, I would probably have them stretch it anyway, even if I thought it was sufficient, because I can never be sure that it's sufficient. It's just like strength training. Someone said, well, how do you know the hip I want people to strengthen their hip flexors for running. And someone said, well, how do you know they're weak? I don't think they ever get weak. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It's still good to do it anyway. It's not like a runner can't use a little more hip strength. And so same with the dorsiflexion. Maybe it's just the act of stretching that might be beneficial. I have no idea.
Yeah, and I've brought this up before to some other folks that I've had on the webinars. Robin and all's work over in Israel, they're starting to show similar in terms of importance of ankle dorsiflexion. But again, I think we're always trying to get to this very specific threshold, and it's like if you exceed it, then you're going to start to have problems. And I don't think we're going to necessarily see that pan out. I mean, there are some studies showing that, but I think everyone just needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and certainly if someone has patellar tendinopathy, it's not going to hurt them to stretch their ankle dorsiflexors. It's that easy, as long as you do the loading as well.
So you're obviously you're running at this point, and your goal is to try and qualify for Boston, correct?
Yeah.
So I think it's great to have your expertise and to delve into things a little bit for the running community, whether they're therapists, coaches, runners themselves. What would you say your top 3 messages are to runners, or the things that you find yourself consistently reminding of runners that seek your services?
Yeah, it's the number one. Maybe we just leave it out here. It's it runs slower on your easy days. That's always the biggest one. I like that 80-20 rule. you know, the Steven Sealer stuff of the polarized training and nothing too much in the middle. And then the beginner runners is run harder on your light days. People don't think they underestimate themselves. You know, tell them one quote I read from a pretty elite runner here in Canada. She was talking about the 5K because I sneaked into the 5K road championships because no one else wanted to do it, I guess. And and she wrote, you know, she loves the 5K, and I think it was Jessica O'Connell, but I'm not sure if that's her name. She doesn't know me, but I was just reading her quote because it was inspiring. You know, when she said, "When you get, I feel like stopping." You know, that was so good. Like, it hurts, and even someone that elite wants to be done at the halfway mark. So for beginner runners to be uncomfortable, and in their training, if they can learn to get uncomfortable, I think that's key. So both run slower and run faster, which takes you back to that old quote, you know, probably attributed to your slow is too fast and your fast is too slow.
Yeah, and there is some.
Sorry, I missed you there, but the last one that I would say is recognize the other can influence pain and injury. It's not just the mechanical loading, you know, and it's too easy to ignore that stuff. You know, my biggest knee pain situation was I was traveling to London to teach on a flight. I was a bit nervous about teaching. I probably drank too many beers. I was there, and my knees were killing the whole time. You know, and I wasn't too worried about because you know, so I just kind of took it easy that week, even though mechanically there wasn't a lot of stress on my system. There's all those other stressors going on, so I just sort of backed off, and then I was totally fine the next week, and my knees were healthy and happy.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to, you know, there's a term that's floating around. I think you, Sig, a couple other people have mentioned. How are you what ecosystem are you creating? You know, and I think that's a great way to look at things when you're working with folks. You know, and it's I think it's it's easier to understand relative to talking about the biopsychosocial approach. I think that sort of encapsulates what the biopsychosocial approach is, by just saying, what kind of ecosystem have you created? I would like to give all my patients a plant when they come in and say, take care of this thing. You know, give it some water, you know, make sure the pH is right, protect it from adverse conditions, and I think that hopefully that would strike a chord with them. So,
is it a chart terry juice plant?
What's that?
Is it a chart terry juice plant?
No, I think those are. You have to go to Michigan or Poland for those. That's actually where a lot of the tart cherry juice crop is.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that it's interesting when I talk to folks about you, I really like a lot of your work. I like, you know, your thought process. But people get so hung up on the fact that you're a PT and a chiro. It's like, you know, the PTs don't like the fact that you're a chiro, and the chiros don't like the fact that you're a PT. And I just laugh at this stuff. Have you experienced any pushback from that when you've been going around teaching or sharing your perspective?
Oh no, because you know the good PTs and the good chiros, which are the majority, they're the same.
I don't agree.
know if you want to hear that. I think it's only on the extremes that you see the big differences. But other than that, I mean, when I was a chiro, or even before I was a chiro, I got all my information from probably more kinesiology research, you know, or sports medicine research. And if you look, most people do that anyway. You get it from the basic sciences, you know. And so it's research is research. It doesn't matter what the profession is. I don't treat as a profession. I treat as a person.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to just address that issue. I do see a lot of people who have a good handle on their fields. They're all rising above this stuff, you know. So again, there are still turf battles that are in place. It's sort of
I think it's more of a political thing in the States, and I understand that. Like, I guess it might be your healthcare system and all of these things and how you guys bill and code, and that's unfortunate. Yeah, but and I think it's unfortunate when I hear of chiro organizations trying to limit PTs to manipulate or adjust and all of those things. And then, so I do understand those battles, but at an individual level and what you do with a patient, it doesn't really matter.
So one of the things that we started discussing when you were in Seattle was Kubo's work.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating. You know, after we finished the course, I had emailed Mal McHugh, who was my primary mentor when I was in New York at NISMAT, and he said, yeah, Kubo's work is great. He explains things in slightly different terminology, which I think is part of the issue, but people are very quick to dismiss it, or they don't factor it into the discussion of stretching. And the general sentiment now, especially in the running and endurance community, is stop stretching completely. It's bad. But I think that's preemptive to jump to that conclusion, or premature. What are the major takeaways from Kubo's work that have affected your clinical work?
It's made me apologize because I was an anti-stretchite, for a long, since the 90s, because I liked Magnuson's work at first. And Magnuson's work was saying that long-term stretching doesn't make you any less stiff. It just gives you more range of motion. And then I would be like, so the people that would say, oh, you can change your posture by stretching, I still don't think you can do that. And then what Kubo's work showed was you actually, the parallel or the series elastic component, we don't know what structure can become less stiff. He just called it passive resistance to torque instead of stiffness. So he showed the opposite of Magnuson's work, which is interesting. He then went and looked at the level of the tendon, and stretching doesn't change the stiffness of the tendon. I have a graph, if you can include it in this, like that I've done for this. On the upslope, like say you're doing a bench press, it would be doing on the eccentric portion, so the stiffness isn't any difference, but there's a change in hysteresis, which means when you bounce off or recoil, it's actually, the curve shifts to the left, meaning it's slightly stiffer. So I know that sounds confusing in the abstract without a picture, but the take home is you might get actually more of an energy return in a muscle after stretching in the long term, in terms of a passive energy bounce.
Because you're eliminating the hysteresis component.
Yeah, well, it just decreases.
Yeah.
Less energy in the tendon is lost as heat. And the implication is there, it helps explain these older studies that show people that stretch, they show increases in their performance in terms of bench press or sprinting, which is really quite surprising because it doesn't make sense, right? But if it's because you've changed the tendon stiffness in terms of the energy loss as heat, the viscoelasticity, that might be the reason. And I don't hear anyone really talking about it. I think it was a neat little find because it was sort of buried in his results and not discussed in the abstract.
Yeah, and I do have that image. You were kind enough to share it with me through Google Drive, so I'll try and post that to accompany this Q&A session. And that work was done, was it 2004? 2002. 2002, yeah, I mean, that's a long time ago, and people just sort of swept it under the rug, and they're like, oh, this doesn't fit into what, my explanation or understanding.
Yeah.
So it just shows you how complex this stuff is. But I will say, you see runners in particular just stretching all the time. No matter what else you tell them, they're going to continue to stretch. So.
Oh, sorry, I didn't even answer your question. So, so in terms of running, how that implies, it means I don't care if you stretch. If you really love it, go ahead. It's probably not the most efficient use of your time. You should probably be strength training instead. But if you really like it, it's probably not going to ruin you.
So this is, I'm just throwing this in there right now. So there's a fellow named Jim Picard, who is going through the fellowship with Joe Brents in the Next Gen Institute, and he had asked me what articles I thought he should read, and I was going to email him later this afternoon with regards to strength training as it relates to running. So I'll just pose that question to you. Are there a few articles that you have in mind when it comes to learning more about the role of strength training for the sport of running?
I can't think of. It's funny. I just told people to remember researchers' names. That one is it's one of those areas I just take it as a given, so I don't think about it anymore. You know, like because we have data going back decades. So every now and then I'll just throw something into a folder, strength training and plyometric. But my take home is just strengthen everything. Don't put the core or the glutes on a pedestal. You know, train your whole body, become an athlete. You know, and if you had to choose specific ones, I would, you know, train like a sprinter and just train heavy exercises and do what every good strength coach does. Start with the basics, you know, start with just simple, slow strength and build into more explosive stuff and mix it all up throughout the year. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Keep it simple. Probably follow a Dan John program or something like that.
So with regards to glute function, you know, people always talk about, you know, glute activation drills, glute amnesia. What do you think is important for runners to understand when it comes to glute function?
I think they're probably less important than your hamstrings and your adductor magnus in terms of hip extension. I mean, they're smaller and they have a smaller, the glutes are smaller and they have a smaller moment arm. You don't see a lot of distance runners with big glutes. You see sprinters. And so I just wouldn't put them on a pedestal. The glute activation never made sense. If they mean glute, like if you warm up, yeah, we know a warm up will lead to potentiation or post activation potentiation if you're doing a maximal activity. But the glute activation sounds like the glutes shut off when people run. And I just don't think that's even possible. We don't even really have any data for that. So I just wouldn't worry about it. But it's still good to do a warm up. And if you go back 100 years, just do your A's and B's and C's and do some strides and run backwards and shuffle side to side and do leg swings and do some squats. And there, you're done. That's it.
Yeah, that jives with, I think there's some classic work by Roger Mann showing that the glute max in particular is not very active throughout the gait cycle. It's really active in anticipation of initial contact and during that early part of stance. But other than that, I mean, yeah, glute med for timing. And there was that study just showing side-lying sort of, I forget who the authors were. It was in JOSPT looking at side-lying hip abduction strength as you break someone through the range. So it's not a match test. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there is an argument to be had there. But, yeah, I think people...
That's for future injury?
Yeah, they prospectively showed that.
So it was like, that was Chris Barton's paper. He was one of the authors. And I think Nielsen was as well. I'm not sure if they were the first author. I don't think I can pronounce the first author. I think it's like Ramsnoff or Ramskoff.
Yeah, actually, you're right. That's who the first author was.
Woo!
Yeah. You always have to be careful when people start throwing out names because you go on PubMed and you try and search it and they like misquote it. It's the wrong year.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
Try and find the manuscript. So gait analysis. Switching gears here a little bit. I really liked the demonstration that you did when you were in Seattle looking at gait analysis, and it's very similar to a lot of the stuff that I've been doing, but you know, it was basically strike, sound, and cadence. And you can change things really quick. I threw up a video recently of a woman, a course actually last weekend, just sort of showing how easy this stuff can be with minimal equipment. Could you just delve into that or explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. Because I teach with the Blaise Dubois course, which is great and would fit well with yours. That's the new trends and running injury prevention. That's what they teach. Well, I teach it slightly different when I do it on my own, but it's the same idea where just look at the really simple things. And cadence is often the easiest and the biggest thing to change. Thanks to Brian Heiderschet's research, like he's just showing you change your cadence, meaning increase steps per minute, 5 to 10%, and you'll sort of get this trickle up change in the kinematics. You get a change in the ground reaction force in terms of the first impact transient. And the whole idea there is, just hit the ground a little bit lighter, and so cadence is number one. Irene Davis was the one who started first talking that I heard about just the sound that you make. So land lighter. and she published papers on that. That was awesome, mate. All she said was just land lighter or land more softly. Like, what a great intervention. And the patient just figures it out on their own. It doesn't matter how. And then I think she showed it didn't matter. They did it a lot of different ways in terms of their kinematics. And the last one is I use barefoot, not because I'm saying that you want to run barefoot. And Irene Davis does this too. And of course, Blaze has done this forever in his course, where you just take the shoes off and it helps them do the other two. It helps them change their cadence and land softer. So it's not saying go run barefoot. It's say, what does that feel like when you run barefoot? Now, can you take that feeling and, run in shoes again? Because some of the other cues, and I'll still do them too, of saying like tighten your glutes or bring your feet closer together or all of those things, they're often harder to translate, I think.
Well, and I think it seems more effective to do this on a treadmill because you do get a little bit more input, especially from the sound of contact. So, but you can change this stuff very quick, and yeah, I do think that folks are reluctant to jump into the gait analysis game because they feel like they need more instrumentation, and I would say not at all. Yeah. It's great to have it and you're in a research setting, but I almost think you're going to have to troubleshoot more because some of the equipment's going to be acting up at some point.
No, and I also think I used to love trying to memorize all the running kinematics and what happened at this joint and the kinetics, and when I would teach an older running course, I would kind of focus on that. And Irene Davis does that too. And I remember taking her course and I was like, you know what, I don't even care about these kinematics and all of this stuff. It doesn't really matter. And so I think people get worried that they need to know everything about the gait cycle. But if you just focus on a couple little things, like I never talk about pronation, or I don't even know what happens when you pronate, the triplanar motion and all those little things. I don't care. You just focus on don't hit the ground as hard and have less force. The rest of the stuff doesn't matter. That's the kind of the point about being simpler again.
And I think Rich Willie, I just had him on last week, and he had echoed that. It's a lot of our models they're oversimplified. So we're trying to draw these conclusions from models that don't accurately represent what we're trying to study. So yeah, I actually just took that slide out of my presentation, looking at the coupled motions of dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, because I just said this doesn't really impact what I do or how I explain this to folks. So with running, what shoe are you running in? Are you still in the New Balance?
I am, and I went up or down. I went up to the 1600, which is only 5.4 ounces. And there's less cushion in there. I'll run in the 1400 still because they're comfy and they're light. But I went to the 16.
So with running shoes, there was actually a really nice video that BJSM just put out. I saw it last weekend. It may have been circulating before that. And it just sort of myth busts a lot of the stuff that folks are told about running shoes and as far as prescription goes. What do you tell the runners? So I'm talking specifically about recreational distance runners. What do you tell them when it comes to shoes?
I do. I really like Blaze's. He has an algorithm of what to follow, of when to change. I think Blaze always gets this reputation of telling people to get rid of their shoes and run barefoot or minimal. It's not really true. So what I say, if there's no injury and they don't want to get faster and they're happy with what they're running in, keep running in whatever shoes you have. If you're just starting running and you've never run before, or you've been injured for a long time and have taken time off, and you do want to get faster, go into a lighter weight shoe. Because we know that lighter is faster. You don't need motion control technologies. It should feel comfortable, and you don't need too much cushion. 10 millimeters would be the idea for optimal energy efficiency, like Roger Cram's work, and that's about it. If you have an injury where it's like at the level of the foot, then I think it's okay to stick around in your big bulky shoe for a short term. But if you have injuries up the chain, then it's probably not a bad idea to switch to a lighter shoe that makes you run more like barefoot or barefoot-like. The caveat of all of that is we assume that just switching to a lighter barefoot-like shoe makes you run like soft and impact moderating. That doesn't always happen with some people. they'll still overstride with a big heel strike. So they have to be a bit careful too. It's not a panacea, that's for sure.
Excellent. So I threw this question out there. One of the things that was interesting is it used to have a URL called the Body Mechanic. Do you still have that?
No, it's too arrogant.
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit of a disconnect based on what your message is. So I was actually glad to see you part with that, because I'm like, man, this is strange. I mean, he has this thing called the Body Mechanic, yet his message is completely the other end of the spectrum. So when did you part with that?
Just maybe 4 months ago. But I had been sort of phasing away from it for a few years. And I only got it because friends of mine owned a flower shop called Cool, Green, and Shady. And so that's kind of clever, and they're good with words. And they were like, you need to get like a name. And so they asked questions about my background in the biomechanics. And they're like, oh, should be the Body Mechanic. And then my life, I'm like, okay. That's it. There's nothing else.
If people were to try and find your work, I mean, it's pretty darn easy, but what's the URL that you would have them go to now?
Oh, just greglehman.ca.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like you've been hard at work on a number of different things, and I want to give you a chance to just plug your, because it's a great resource, and you're one of the few folks out there who just puts out so much great information for free, and it's just, I know I reference a lot of it, and I draw on pretty heavily. So you have a pain fundamentals book. Can you just tell people how to go about accessing it and using it?
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that one, because I like the Explain Pain guys and the NOI group and Adrian Lowe's in the States, but I just wanted to create something that was smaller, that you could have like a PDF, you know, of one sheet at a time, just to get people talking about like pain is an alarm. So that's the point of that book. I think there's maybe only 20 pages, you know, sort of 20 simple ideas just to get people talking about pain. And that's at greglehman.ca, and that's on like the sidebar. And I've been really fortunate because I think like people would just email me and ask to translate it. And I was like, sure. So I think right now it's, I have to update the website, but I think we have it in French, Spanish, Dutch might be coming, German, and maybe Italian. So it's, yeah, because it's like open access and it's free. When I was a researcher, I used to try to do that too, is publish all my stuff in open access. And then there's a less popular workbook that's sort of like a guide to exercise, that, like, I think I call it treatment fundamentals. You know, just a simple way to reconceptualize how to prescribe exercise, getting away from the ideal or corrective movement strategy idea.
Well, and that segues right into my next question. So I had posted a picture during your talk when we were in Seattle, and it just created this huge uproar, and I thought that would not be the case. It was essentially just saying how it's unhelpful to tell someone that they have dysfunctional movement, essentially. Can you explain why you put that slide up and why you think that's an important message?
I think the impetus was, you know, there's this shift to stop people talking about the structural model. You know, just because you have a tear, just because there's damage or degeneration, you know, that doesn't equal pain. And I thought that the next step was saying, well, just because you move in a way that looks different, you know, that doesn't equal pain either. Because if you ask someone, hey, what's wrong with moving slightly differently or having your head flexed or your back tilted? They end up saying, well, that's going to put abnormal loads on the spine or the joint. And then you say, well, then what will happen? And then they'll say, well, that'll lead to like degeneration and pain. Right? You can see that's what I would hear. So they just sounded the same thing to me. They're just a couple of steps away. And I may be misrepresenting the argument. And so to me, it was sort of reconceptualizing bad movement and saying, yeah, some movements hurt, but it doesn't mean that they're bad in and of themselves. It just mean they're not tolerated at that point in time. You know, it gives you more options in how to move, and it simplifies our assessment. We don't have to get into the nitty gritty of, you know, I did research on the prone leg extension, that it has to fire in a stereotypical pattern. We really don't see that. You know, we consistently see that the body has lots of options, and variability and asymmetry is normal. There's just something else that goes on that give people pain.
Yeah, and I think that that slide really resonated with me. So I was happy to see you put that up there, and I think that a lot of folks still aren't considering the pain literature. And I think the pendulum, we were talking about this when you were in Seattle, the pendulum swung so far to the other extreme, and it's coming back to the middle now, which I think is natural for any when you start introducing a new concept. So, but I think that you're right at the cutting edge of all this stuff, and it's really helpful to have you pumping out so much good work and just sharing your perspective. One other thing, so I would like to put this out there. With a lot of the stuff that I'm putting out online, what's your critique of my work? What resonates with you? What do you get hung up on, or how is it perceived to you?
There's not enough disco music or sound in your videos, right? That's it.
Yeah, more sound. Yeah, you have to be careful with all the copyright stuff. So
that's right. Well, that's a good question. I don't think I have made fun of you in a while.
My friends see me and always start slow motion marching or doing different drills, and yeah, it's funny. Everyone's always saying, "Hey, your stuff is great, la la la." I say, "Well, be a little bit tough with me. I'm trying to refine it." So that's, and if you don't come up with anything, that's cool too.
I'll comb through it.
Okay.
Well, you know what happens though, because you're like me, still like biomechanics, and so I think the misinterpretation is sometimes how you would use the biomechanics.
Yeah.
If you don't explain, I'm not really too caught up on the form here. I'm just doing this test for another reason, or because you have that test you do with the foot thing, right?
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, and so someone might say, "Oh, see, he loves the biomechanics and needs to correct that." Like, no, that's just a window into something that's going on there. It's something that's worthy of correcting. Like when you find an impairment, someone's weak or they don't have range of motion, it doesn't mean that caused the pain. We don't know if it's just a consequence of pain, but it's still worth trying to change. We don't have to get caught up in the academics of what came first. It's okay just to change something. Just because sometimes that's helpful in of itself. Just like hip strength. You don't really know why increasing your hip strength decreases knee pain. But we don't have to. It's still a worthy endeavor to load up the hips when someone has knee pain.
And to load the knee too,
Yep.
I think it mitigates threat a little bit to be working, outside of just the level of the knee. But that study that just came out that, yeah, people may expedite the rehab process by 1 week, but if someone's dealing with knee pain, strengthen the hip, great. Strengthen the knee, great. Which again gets back to your point of let's keep things simple. Put things under load, figure out what folks tolerate, and as you say, poke the bear. Meaning it's okay to have a little bit of pain or discomfort. It's probably helpful.
Yeah.
So no, that's all great stuff. So one or two more questions, and I'll let you get on with your day. Everyone gets into an uproar when you start talking about kinesio tape. How are you using tape, if at all, in your work?
Oh, almost how I use manual therapy and everything like that. It's purely.
That's great. I wanted to dovetail that conversation.
Yeah, it's purely a symptom modifier, and it's purely a Band-Aid. And there's nothing wrong with Band-Aids, right? Sometimes people bleed out and they need them in the short term. You didn't never leave a Band-Aid on for 6 weeks or more. So tape is the same idea. And tape to me is when you do manual therapy or you do a mobilization with movement, or you follow Pete O'Sullivan stuff who changes how someone's moves and their pain feels better, like what does that tell the patient? That tells them that their pain is malleable. So that's what tape does. It reinforces the idea that they're not falling apart. I think you can do it that way. And you don't put it on as a crutch. You show that, hey, this is about sensitivity. Isn't this fantastic that these 2 strips of tape changed your pain in your knee so quickly? Do you really think that there's a lot of damage in there if that just happened? That's why I like tape. At the level of the foot for plantar fasciosis, I actually use leukotape. That might do something more structural. I don't know, but that's okay. It's just a short-term orthotic for 6 weeks to let them settle down. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with putting someone in a cast if they break a bone, so it's the same idea.
Well, and I think it's your explanation that sort of differentiates, how you're incorporating it versus the next person. And I think that's the exact way you explain it, to say, look, something can't be damaged or injured if all you're doing is putting on a couple pieces of tape and all of a sudden it's changing the severity of your symptoms. So, and that's pretty cool. And it's just a reminder, like you said, to show folks that it's malleable. So the one final question that I have for you is, you always make it a point to cite a study, and you always explain how the skin on your chin sort of slides around in a frictionless manner. And folks when they explain joint mobilizations or manipulations, they talk about all these different ways and angles for your hand contact and delivering the thrust or the mobilization. Can you explain that study in a bit more detail, and then I'll let you get on with your day?
Deck building. So it was a great study, and I was lucky to be a part of it. Not an author, but I knew the guys doing it, and I helped out a little. I was Kim Ross, Dave Bresnick, and Stu McGill, and they were chiros, and they had been teaching manipulation at the chiropractic college for decades, and they really thought it was taught to in a sophisticated way that wasn't necessary. So when you did a spine manipulation, like say in the thoracic spine where you just leaned over top and pushed down, we call that a carver. I'm not sure what the physios call it, where you're just pushing. The theory at the time was you had to angle your hands, right, to be in line with the direction of the facets, because you wanted to slide those facets, cephalad is the word, like up toward the head. And they were like, no one does this. You just push straight down. That's all that matters, and that's the only force. So what they realized was the only way you can slide, like you can't actually slide the vertebra, if this is the head's up here, and you wanted to slide the vertebra forward because of the angle. They thought people would say you got to contact on an angle. And they said you can't actually slide the vertebra forward because the skin, just like here, just slides around on the bone. The only way I can move my jaw to the, my left is to be on the side that's perpendicular to my massive striking jaw. But if I go on the top of the jaw, I'd have to have some friction on the bone below in order to slide it this direction, right? I'd have to be able to grab it and push. So with the vertebra on the spine, the only force is the one that goes straight down. You can't actually slide anything forward. Just like you can't put your hand on your biceps, right, and grab the muscle underneath there and make the bicep shorten, because that skin just slides around on top of the biceps. It's frictionless. So why I love it, it just simplifies things. You can't twist a rib. You can't spin your hands on the rib to make it rotate because you can't grab it. You can't grab the rib. You can only slide. You can only push it from the side. So the effective force is the one that just goes perpendicular to the joint surface. And that's also been proven again by a guy named Pearl, Stephen Pearl, and Greg Kotchak. Greg's he's a great biomechanic chiro research out of Calgary. And they showed that as well in a pig's spine. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's neato.
Yeah, everything that we've covered is just, I think it's going to be very helpful for the online community. So I'll let you get on with your deck building, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat with me. I have a lot of respect for what you're up to, and I always laugh when I met you for the first time in person. You had flown out here from Toronto, and I'm like, oh man, he's going to be exhausted, and he's going to be up early to teach, and we were up till probably like 3 o'clock talking shop. So very rarely do you find someone as passionate as you are, and who's probably losing sleep over some of these clinical questions that you have, which is awesome. So
well, you also had beer, so this is the reason. We
have to. We're in Seattle. We're in the land of beer. So
I've never seen a growler before.
Yeah, next time I'll make sure to double up the order. So.
No, that's not necessary.
Well, you caught your flight on the way back. We were a little concerned, but you caught your flight. So
Yeah, I thought it was later than it was.
Well, you should just probably factor that hour cushion in all the time. So. Well, hey, thank you so much. I'll run this on my website. I think it automatically goes live on Twitter after we wrap up. And any other final plugs? Anything for people to access your information or get a hold of you? I know you're doing a lot of speaking right now. So where's your next stop?
Speaking, I'm going all over. There's like Norway in August and England again in a couple of weeks in Edinburgh. I'd like to teach more in the States though. It's a nicer flight.
Yeah, I'm sure. You've been, it seems like living on planes, so. But yeah, these folks are very fortunate to have you, and I'm sure you will not disappoint.
No, actually, you know what's great about the courses, and I should have said this, is the people that come, right? And that's what if you notice, I kind of make everyone talk because I like to steal everyone's ideas. You know, you learn a ton in courses from the people. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's why I'm most happy to do it.
All right. Well, hey, I'll let you run. Have a great week, and thanks again for your time. And that's it. Greg Lehman.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Yep. Take care.
All righty.